Picture this. You're a foreign ambassador in 1590s England, and you've just been summoned to the private chambers of the most powerful woman in Europe. You enter expecting political negotiations, but instead you find Queen Elizabeth I, nearly 70 years old, demanding that you undress while she watches. This isn't fiction. This actually happened, multiple times. If you enjoy discovering the scandalous secrets hidden beneath the polished portraits of history's most famous rulers, smash that like button. And stick around, because what I'm about to reveal about the Virgin Queen will absolutely shatter everything you thought you knew about her. Drop a comment telling me which revelation shocked you most. Elizabeth I ruled England for 45 years, from 1558 to 1603, presiding over what historians call the Golden Age. She's remembered as the Virgin Queen, the monarch who sacrificed marriage and motherhood for her kingdom. Portraits show her in elaborate gowns, covered neck to toe, radiating pure, untouchable majesty. But behind those palace walls, Elizabeth harbored desires and engaged in behaviors so disturbing that her own courtiers whispered about them in terror. These weren't innocent eccentricities. These were deeply troubling obsessions that grew more extreme as she aged, revealing a woman consumed by control, vanity, and something far darker. Let's start with perhaps the most documented and disturbing of Elizabeth's pleasures, forcing men to strip in her presence. This wasn't a one-time occurrence or exaggeration by enemies. Multiple ambassadors, courtiers, and servants recorded this bizarre ritual. Elizabeth would summon young, attractive men to her chambers, particularly foreign diplomats, who couldn't refuse a royal command, and she would make them remove their doublets, their shirts, sometimes more, while she sat there watching, evaluating, commenting on their physiques. The Duke of Württemberg's ambassador described being commanded to bare his chest so Elizabeth could examine his build. Sir James Melville, the Scottish ambassador, wrote in horror about being asked to disrobe so the Queen could compare his legs to those of other men at court. She didn't just glance, she studied, she touched, she made degrading comparisons out loud, humiliating these men who had no choice but to comply. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. As Elizabeth aged and her power solidified, this behavior escalated. She began keeping detailed mental notes about which courtiers had the finest calves, the broadest shoulders, the most attractive features. She would discuss men's bodies openly with her ladies-in-waiting, rating them like livestock. Imagine the most powerful person in your world, forcing you to strip, while making lewd observations about your body, knowing you cannot refuse, cannot complain, cannot escape. That was the reality for countless men at Elizabeth's court. Elizabeth's second disturbing pleasure was her obsessive need to kiss virtually every man who entered her presence, regardless of their consent or comfort. And we're not talking about polite pecks on the cheek. Contemporary accounts describe deep, prolonged kisses on the mouth that left ambassadors shocked and disgusted. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Elizabeth kissed him on the lips upon first meeting and continued doing so at every subsequent encounter. Behavior he found most peculiar and unwelcome for a woman of her age and station. The German diplomat Paul Hensner witnessed Elizabeth kissing multiple courtiers during a single audience, describing it as excessive even by the loose standards of the English court. But the compulsion went beyond mere greeting. Elizabeth demanded goodnight kisses from her favorites, sometimes calling them back multiple times if she deemed the first kiss insufficient. Robert Dudley, her longtime favorite, reportedly complained to friends about the exhausting ritual of kissing the Queen goodnight, sometimes required to return to her chambers 3 or 4 times before she was satisfied. The psychological element here is chilling. Elizabeth used kissing as a power display, forcing physical intimacy on men who couldn't refuse her. She was asserting dominance, reminding everyone that their bodies, their lips, their personal boundaries meant nothing against her royal authority. As she grew older and her appearance deteriorated, this compulsion intensified, as if she was trying to physically force men to find her desirable, to prove she still possessed the allure of youth. Now we arrive at perhaps the most disturbing of Elizabeth's pleasures, one that reveals the truly dark nature of her obsessions, her systematic spying on the sexual activities of her courtiers. particularly her ladies-in-waiting and male favorites. Elizabeth maintained an elaborate network of informants whose sole purpose was to report on the intimate lives of everyone at court. She placed spies in bedrooms, bribed servants to report on who visited whose chambers at night, and even had peepholes constructed in certain rooms where she suspected romantic encounters might occur. This wasn't about security or preventing scandal. This was about vicarious participation in the sexual lives she publicly denied herself. When Elizabeth discovered that her lady-in-waiting, Lettice Knollys, had secretly married Robert Dudley, the man Elizabeth herself desired, the Queen's rage was apocalyptic. But it wasn't just anger at betrayal. Elizabeth demanded explicit details about their wedding night. She interrogated servants about how often the couple shared a bed, what sounds came from their chambers, every intimate detail she could extract. She kept Lettice banished from court for decades, but she constantly sought updates about the couple's private life, obsessing over the sexuality she claimed to reject. Lady Mary Howard made the fatal mistake of secretly marrying without Elizabeth's permission. When the Queen discovered it, she didn't just punish Mary politically, she forced Mary to describe her wedding night in graphic detail before the entire Privy Council, a public humiliation designed to satisfy Elizabeth's voyeuristic obsession while destroying Mary's reputation. This pattern repeated constantly. Elizabeth would fly into violent rages when her courtiers married or conducted affairs, but she always demanded complete accounts of their intimate encounters first. It was psychological torture, forcing her subjects to feed her voyeuristic appetite while knowing they would be punished for the very activities she demanded to hear about. Elizabeth's fourth pleasure was so bizarre that modern historians often gloss over it, perhaps because it seems too strange to be true, but multiple sources confirm it. Elizabeth collected people with physical deformities and abnormalities, keeping them at court for her entertainment and study. She maintained a court dwarf named Thomasina, but not simply as a companion, as other royals might. Elizabeth would have Thomasina perform increasingly humiliating acts for entertainment. She collected individuals with unusual physical features, hunchbacks, people with extra digits, those with facial abnormalities, and she would examine them like specimens, discussing their deformities in front of the entire court. But here's where it becomes deeply disturbing. Elizabeth seemed particularly fascinated by sexual abnormalities and reproductive deformities. She interrogated her physicians about hermaphrodites, demanding to know explicit details about their anatomy. When rumors spread about a woman in London born with ambiguous genitalia, Elizabeth commanded the woman be brought to court so she could examine her, personally subjecting this poor individual to humiliating physical inspection to satisfy the Queen's morbid curiosity. Contemporary accounts suggest Elizabeth's fascination with physical abnormalities was connected to her own body anxieties. She was obsessed with the idea of physical perfection versus corruption, constantly examining her own aging body for signs of decay, comparing herself to those she deemed physically inferior. It was a twisted psychology where she simultaneously pursued beauty while finding comfort in observing those she considered deformed, as if their existence validated her own fading appearance. Elizabeth's fifth disturbing pleasure involved commissioning and collecting nude portraits and erotic artwork, which she kept hidden in private chambers away from public view. While nude art wasn't uncommon among European nobility, Elizabeth's collection was reportedly extensive and specifically focused on idealized young bodies, particularly young male nudes. Her art agents were instructed to acquire works depicting classical gods and heroes in various states of undress, but Elizabeth's interest went beyond mere artistic appreciation. Courtiers who gained access to her private galleries described walls covered with paintings of nude youths, sculptures of athletic male forms, and increasingly explicit mythological scenes featuring young men in vulnerable or suggestive positions. John Dee, her astrologer and advisor, recorded that Elizabeth would spend hours alone in these private galleries, particularly in her later years when her public image as the Virgin Queen was most rigidly maintained. The contrast was stark and disturbing. Publicly, she presented herself as above carnal desires, wedded only to England. But privately, she surrounded herself with erotic imagery, feeding desires she publicly denied. The psychological implication is haunting. Elizabeth couldn't have the physical relationships she desired without destroying her political power and the Virgin Queen mythology, so she created private spaces where she could indulge vicariously, gazing at representations of the youth and sexuality that were slipping away from her with each passing year. Elizabeth's sixth pleasure was her habit of verbally degrading her male favorites in increasingly sexual and humiliating ways, particularly as she aged. This wasn't occasional royal temper. This was systematic psychological abuse masked as flirtation. She would publicly discuss men's presumed sexual prowess or inadequacies, making crude jokes about their manhood before the entire court. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, one of her final favorites, endured constant public speculation about his sexual capabilities, all encouraged or initiated by Elizabeth herself. She would make crude gestures, use explicit language, and force young men to endure conversations about their private anatomy and presumed sexual experiences. Sir Walter Raleigh described in private letters how Elizabeth would corner young courtiers and interrogate them about their sexual history, demanding details about encounters with women, then mocking them cruelly if their experiences seemed limited, or conversely calling them whoremongers if they'd been too active. There was no winning. The purpose wasn't information, it was domination through humiliation. The Duc de Sully, visiting from France, was horrified when Elizabeth, in her late 60s, made explicit comments about his physical attributes in front of her entire court, discussing his presumed sexual capabilities in language he described as more appropriate to a brothel than a throne room. He couldn't object. He couldn't defend himself. He simply had to stand there while the most powerful woman in Europe discussed his body like he was a piece of meat at market. This behavior escalated dramatically in Elizabeth's final decade. As her body deteriorated with age, her verbal degradation of young, attractive men became more frequent and more vicious, as if she was punishing them for possessing the youth and vitality she'd lost. Elizabeth's seventh and perhaps most psychologically revealing pleasure was her obsessive preservation of tokens from potential or imagined romantic encounters. She kept an elaborate collection of personal items from men she'd desired, touched, or kissed, storing them in locked boxes in her private chambers. We're talking about locks of hair, handkerchiefs, pieces of clothing, even fingernail clippings from her favorites. When Robert Dudley died, Elizabeth locked herself in her chambers with his last letter, refusing to eat or emerge for days. When servants finally broke in, they found her clutching not just the letter, but a collection of Dudley's personal items she'd been secretly gathering for decades. His gloves, a shirt he'd worn, strands of his hair carefully preserved in a locket. But it went beyond sentimental collection. Elizabeth would reportedly smell these items, touch them obsessively, even sleep with them near her pillow. One lady-in-waiting described walking in on the elderly queen, rubbing a shirt that had belonged to a long-dead favorite against her face, weeping and whispering to it like it was still alive. The psychological portrait this paints is devastating. Elizabeth, trapped by her own mythology as the Virgin Queen, unable to pursue normal relationships without destroying her power, created a substitute reality with these objects. They were physical manifestations of the life she couldn't have, the intimacy she'd sacrificed for the throne, touchstones to desires she could never fully satisfy. As Elizabeth entered her final years, these behaviors didn't diminish. They intensified. The undressing rituals became more frequent, the kissing more desperate, the voyeurism more invasive, the collection of deformities more grotesque, the nude art more explicit, the verbal degradation more vicious, the preservation mania more obsessive. Courtiers walked on eggshells, never knowing when an innocent interaction might trigger one of the queen's disturbing fixations. Young men avoided serving at court if they could, knowing they might be subjected to humiliating physical examinations or forced intimate encounters with a woman old enough to be their grandmother, who wielded absolute power over their lives and futures. The woman who'd ruled so brilliantly for decades, who defeated the Spanish Armada and ushered in England's golden age, spent her final years increasingly consumed by these dark pleasures trapped in a prison of her own making, where power and desire twisted into something deeply troubling. When Elizabeth died in 1603 at age 69, her ladies-in-waiting discovered the full extent of her secret collections. The locked boxes filled with personal items from long-dead favorites, the private galleries of erotic art, the detailed journals where she'd recorded observations about courtiers' bodies and presumed sexual activities, the network of spies she'd maintained to feed her voyeuristic obsessions. Her successor, James I, ordered most of these materials destroyed, not because they were politically damaging, but because they were considered so disturbing, so contrary to Elizabeth's public image, that their existence seemed almost sacrilegious. The Virgin Queen mythology had to be preserved, even if it meant erasing evidence of the deeply troubled woman beneath the crown. A few items survived in private collections and diplomatic correspondence, enough for historians to piece together this disturbing portrait of a brilliant ruler whose personal life was characterized by troubling obsessions and behaviors that would be considered predatory and psychologically abusive by any modern standard. So what do we make of Queen Elizabeth's worrying sexual pleasures? These weren't harmless quirks or exaggerated rumors. They were patterns of behavior documented by multiple independent sources, revealing a woman who used her absolute power to force physical intimacy, voyeuristically invade privacy, collect and examine human beings like specimens, surround herself with erotica while publicly claiming virginity, verbally degrade and humiliate those who couldn't defend themselves, and obsessively preserve tokens of desires she could never truly satisfy. Modern psychology would recognize these as manifestations of profound sexual dysfunction, control issues, and the psychological damage caused by sacrificing intimate human connection for political power. Elizabeth made a choice, probably the right choice for England's survival, to remain unmarried and childless, to maintain the political fiction of the Virgin Queen. But that choice came with a devastating psychological cost. Her story reminds us that absolute power combined with unfulfilled desire creates dangerous dynamics. When one person holds complete authority over others' bodies, careers, and lives, consent becomes meaningless. Elizabeth's courtiers couldn't refuse her demands, couldn't set boundaries, couldn't protect themselves from her obsessions. They were trapped in a gilded cage with an increasingly troubled monarch whose brilliance in statecraft was matched by deeply disturbing personal behaviors. The Virgin Queen wasn't virgin by virtue but by political necessity, and that forced abstinence twisted into obsessions that harmed everyone around her. It's a cautionary tale about the price of power, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the human cost of sacrificing intimate connection for political survival. Elizabeth was one of history's greatest monarchs, but she was also a deeply troubled woman whose worrying pleasures reveal the darkness that can lurk behind even the most glittering crown. What shocked you most about these revelations? Let me know in the comments below.